You know, last week we played a little bit with salt, but I wanted to show you a couple of variations of it. So with these, I used a couple different types of salt. So this square right here, on the more left side of the screen than the orange. This one I used kosher salt with, I reuse a lot of my kosher salt when I'm doing these, so that's why I have a little bit of dark spots that pop up here and there. So this one was just kosher salt, and this one was about the same amount, but with like a Himalayan salt, so a really nice fine grind. And then both of these I did with Himalayan salt, but just did with different levels of concentration. So you can see that depending on the size of the salt you use, the amount you use, and also depending on how wet the paper is when you put the salt down, that's going to create a lot of different textures. So for something like this one makes me think more of like a frozen lake. So if I wanted this to be kind of, turn this into a scene, I would probably go over it with some glazing techniques, add a little bit of landscaping around it to create kind of a wintry feel. This one, it reminds me a little bit more of like bubbles in the ocean. So this one I might turn into like a whale painting if I was working with this one. This one doesn't have a ton happening here, but I do like it, and this would be fun to turn those little white spots into flowers if I wanted to, by just adding a couple hints of other color, almost like a sunset field. This is how my brain works when I'm looking at salt patterns on paper. So, and like this one, it also kind of reminds me more of like a bubble, or I always turn my papers around too once I do my salt spreads, because I really want to see what's in them. This one I'm not sure on yet, but the other ones I have ideas for. So that's something you can do with the salt, different size salt, amount of salt, how wet your paper is when you put the salt on it will make a huge difference in how it affects it. So this one was about the same level of wetness as like if you're doing a nice even wash. So a little bit damp, but not like dripping wet, more of the velvet stage. This one was a little bit on the drier side. These two are about the same level of moisture content on them when I did them, so it makes a difference. It's fun. And then if you're like me and you have the salt granules that have a little bit of deposits of color from various paintings, you can also put it directly on white water, I guess white water, clear water, and drop it on, because it'll still deposit a little bit of color into it, but it'll be a much softer effect. Let's do that here. So I'm just going to a little bit of water and some salt on it, because I know we went over this a little bit last week. But for those of you that are just joining this week, I'm still going to do a little bit of a demo there. So here I have my reused salt that has some color in it, and here I just have a little bit of a greenish blue that I just put some salt on. Still fairly wet, pretty glossy in the corners. You can see it's kind of pulling up there. If I move the paper, the pigment wants to move a little bit. So this one's a fairly wet application. Yes, leave the salt on until it dries completely. That's going to give you those really clear centers. If it's still a little bit wet and you brush it off, it'll kind of blend into itself a little bit. So like for this, there's a lot on here. I don't have one that's in the medium stage, but this one's still pretty wet. So if I were to tap it on my table, some of the salt will fall off, but if I brush it off now, you can see that it kind of hold that paint. You still get a little bit of that edge work from the salt granules, but it'll kind of blend into itself if you pull the salt off too early. And I'm just kind of getting larger pools of water ready, of watercolor ready for the next step, which is a little bit on the wetter side. We're going to be using the pipettes or using the paintbrush itself to create some droplets on the page. We're going to have some fun with blowing paint around with a straw. You can also use a hairdryer for this on a higher setting, just depends on how much control you want. And especially for some of the more wet techniques like the flour and the salt, if you want to speed up the process, you can use a hairdryer as well once at about the halfway point, because that means the pigment's mostly stuck to the paper. So if I look at my flower petal paper, it's still a little wet because it's still buckling quite a bit here. I can see that it's raised here in the center. That's where the wettest part of the painting is. And same with this guy, it's buckling the other direction. So at this point, because the pigments are very set, if I wanted to take a hairdryer to it to make it dry faster, I could. But if they're still super, super wet, it'll kind of blow the water around, which you'll see here in a minute when we're doing this. And if I do use the hairdryer, I will mute my microphone so it's not quite as loud because it gets really loud. So I just have a fresh piece of paper here, and I am going to take my pipette, because I have created a little bit of watercolor in each one of these, and I'm actually going to add a little bit more water to each of them so I have a lot more color to work with. I'm adding a little bit, but that means it's going to be a little bit more pastel when I put it on the paper. But I'm going to pull up all that color from the palette with my pipette. And I'm going to do a couple different dots. I can do this gently, or I can do it fast, and you can get a little bit of splatter with that. And then if you want to make it more, have a little bit more movement, you can take a straw and you just blow through the straw. If you do a really quick blow like that, it'll splatter really fast. But you can also do smaller, more gentle to create some different lines, and it's a little bit more wild. My very forceful one got all over my desk now, so I'll have to clean that up later, but that's okay. And then when you're doing that, you can do different colors and like blow them towards each other or away from each other. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. You can get a little bit of that kind of color blending like we were doing with that very wet flower. And this one will take a while to dry. The nice thing about this though is because it's a splatter, and if you like what it's doing but you don't necessarily want it to be so dark, you can go in with like paper towel or rag and just set it on top very gently, so you don't want to disturb the outlines underneath, and then pick that up. And so I got most of the color and water off of this blue section here, but I didn't jar or push the exterior of that splatter effect. And it's orange one that I got a little bit of the blue in, because it's so wet, I can move it around, and sometimes if there's a lot, it'll kind of create its own bead, and you can run that off the page if you want, or you can make gravity work for you a little bit and kind of tap the paper, create some more wild effects there. It's a lot of fun though, and this is really, I like to do this as backgrounds. I've done this on backgrounds for a couple different portraits, for pet portraits and things like that, but I've also done this as a background on when I do more of like a watercolor pouring style painting to create a little bit more movement. Let's see if I can find it. So like for this one, I did a combination of a little bit of splattering and pouring and just letting the colors kind of do what they do on the paper. And then this one I did some inking on top of it and things like that. But for like a piece like this, I'm using the water to create borders of where I want the paint to go, and then I kind of push it around, and I'll use my hair dryer to create a little bit more depth of color where the pigment kind of get pushed to a certain point, and you can kind of play around with that. So I'll demo that pushing of the paint with the hair dryer versus this guy here in a second. But yeah. And if you want, you can also use the pipette a little bit at an angle to just kind of create a big blob. There's a lot of things you can do. The pipettes are nice because you can kind of control the angles a little bit more. You can also use them to pick up some of that extra water off the page if you want to as well. You can also use the pipette if you have a little bit more. Use the side of the pipette to do this part. You can create a little bubbling in it. You can also mix different things with your water to create some different effects. One thing you can do is, I forgot to do this for this class, but if you have a little bit of dish soap or hand soap, you can make a little bit of a soapy, sudsy solution. Kind of dip your straw into it by holding the tip and putting that on the paper and blowing into it to kind of create bubbles. And it'll kind of do a similar effect as the plastic, where it'll create pockets of color and deposits of color around the edge. But if you want the splatters to be more of a subtle effect, you can go in with a paper towel or a rag and pull that color up. If you want them to be stronger, you can just let it sit, let it do its thing. The wetter the paint and the water is, the more variation of deposit you will have. So as it dries, some areas will dry faster than others. I have an example of that here that I think I moved or fell on the floor. So like here, I put a lot of water on, and I just kind of created let it splatter. And then let the paint just kind of cool up where it wanted to and let it dry. So that kind of creates these little deposits of color, which sometimes can be called a backwash, because it's wanting to go into drier areas where paper's warping more. It'll kind of settle into different areas too. So yeah, so I did use this for a background for a pet portrait, and for that what I ended up doing was I did the portrait part first, and then I went around the object that I was painting, the pet, and then I'll do an example on one of these guys. So what I'll do sometimes, depending on the type of thing, is I will draw my center image first, and then I'll go around and wet very, very close to the outline of the image. And then I'll take color and deposit it in. And because I'm using air to move it, I would make sure it's angling away from what I don't want to get splattered, and do kind of like that. But you can also do this first and do on the portrait on top, because I've done that before as well. It just kind of depends on what I'm feeling that day and what I want the focus of the painting to be. So I did a few pet portraits for somebody that was of their cat, and their cats are all black and white. So I did some fun color splatters in the background and then drew the cats on top and then painted and added the ink later, just to give it a little bit more fun. Then in the realm of splatters, another way you can make them is by either like loading up your paintbrush with a good amount of water and paint and like just tapping it on your hand, and the water will kind of fly off randomly. You can also use your finger and gently pull on the bristles and just kind of quickly release them. And that will also give you some splatter droplets. You can also use a toothbrush for this, an old toothbrush for smaller droplets, and do the same kind of thing. Create some different sizes depending on what you're using. So with a toothbrush, you're going to get a really fine mist. With more of a paintbrush, you're going to get bigger droplets. And then if you're just kind of throwing it on, they're going to be even bigger. The splatter technique, you can use pretty much any color and any paint with. So if I'm doing more of a space thing, or if I want to have an appearance of like snow falling, I'll take like a opaque white paint and splatter it on top of my finished painting. And if I don't want it to hit any areas, you can cover it up with a piece of paper, and it'll create an edge where you're not splattering, and that can help protect what you don't want to paint to. And if you don't want it to be super perfect, you can kind of tear up the edges a little bit more, so you still get a little bit of that overlay, but not make it such a harsh line. And you can make that into any shape. So if I have, say, this guy, and I don't want something in the shape of, I don't know, a snowman, kind of, to get covered in something, I'm just going to take my paper and cut it out and set it on top, and take my color and splatter around it. And the more color I splatter with, the more noticeable it's going to be. And depending on how wet it is, it's going to be more noticeable. But if I take that off, then it's not in that area. This one, is that what you're talking about, Abby? Yeah. So that is actually with the masking fluid, and that's one we're going to go over with next time. But you can also do something similar to that with negative painting, where you take a similar color or similar shade on top, and you paint a shape, and you do kind of a glazing around it. And this is something that you'll see a lot in, or at least I noticed it a lot in like Michaela's work and Remy Nose's work as well, where they do a lot of negative painting. It's not something I'm best at, that I'm working on it. But that's a way you can also create a similar thing, a similar effect without using masking fluid. And within that, if you wanted to, you can add lighter deposits of water to create more texture, or darker color deposits to create a little bit more variation, so it's not as harsh. Just checking my list of effects before I get too carried away. Okay. Because there's a lot, and there's a lot more than what I'm going over today as well. So, but these are fun ones that you can do a lot with without having a ton of equipment or not needing a ton of space to do. Because there's other ones that require a lot of materials to make happen and a lot of space and like really big sheets of paper, and they're a lot of fun to do, but it's a lot to handle sometimes. So, okay. So this next one, I'm going to kind of demonstrate how to do this splatter effect that we were doing with like a hair dryer. So I'm just going to go ahead and just do a big blotch of color on my paper. And this one's really loose. It's really wet. You can see where those darker areas are where there's a lot more condensed water and pigment versus just water, where this is going to be a little bit just on the wet side. And I'm just kind of doing a random shape here. And then I'm going to take my hair dryer and I'm going to use it on high first. I'm going to mute myself, I think. Yeah. Hard to mute when I'm doing this on mobile. Yeah, so I'm going to mute myself while I'm running the hair dryer, but I'm going to start it on high, and it's going to kind of blow it around a lot. And then I might switch it to low and just kind of push the paper, or push the pigment on the paper, and that'll give some different deposit effects compared to like the splatters and just kind of letting the paint sit on the paper. So it's really fun to do. So because things were drying at different speeds because of the amount of water that got saturated into the paint, or water that got saturated into the paper rather, you're getting these edges that get created by where the paint dries faster. So here it dried pretty fast up here, and that's why we got this little edge here in this darker pool that just kind of hung out for a little bit. And then I switched the hairdryer onto high again to kind of push more out. And you can do that. You can always stop wherever you want and just let it sit. But that kind of creates these really fun textures and color variations within the colors that are deposited on the page. And you can do it like this where it's a little bit more abstract, but you can also do that over like a larger page. If you're doing like a landscape painting, doing this with various shades of greens and yellows will give us some cool kind of land effects and things like that. So. And then because it's with the hairdryer, it dries super, super fast compared to our splatters that we did earlier. And so it speeds up that process a little bit. But if you want to use the hairdryer to just dry the pigment a little bit faster, what I would recommend is when you're doing the color and you're depositing it on the paper, letting it wait a minute or so, so you're not getting like this super high glossiness to the paint and the water on the paper, because that means it's super, super wet, and the movement of the air is going to push it around more than we want it to, especially if you want it to be a nice, soft, smooth, finished piece of color on the paper. So I'm letting that hang out for a minute before I go in with the hairdryer. So that's going to let me know that the pigment's kind of adhered to the paper a little bit more. It's going to let me know that the water is more absorbed into the paper and not just sitting on the surface. So you can see already that it's still glossy, but it's definitely toned down a little bit. The pigment is kind of spreading into itself a little bit more evenly now. And if I go in with my hairdryer on low, that's high, it's not pushing it around nearly as much. So it's not pushing it around nearly as much. And then it's a little bit drier. It's still a little bit wet, but it definitely speeds up the process. And so where it's at now is what I would call a velvet finish. So you can, it's hard to see on the camera, I think, but there's a little tiny bit of sheen to it. I can see the texture of the paper a little bit more, but it's mostly dry. But if I were to tap it, it's going to pull up on my hand. So there's still a little bit of moisture in it, but if I go in with another color now, it's not going to spread out nearly as strongly as if it was just wet. Any questions so far? Okay, cool. Oh, yeah. Yeah, so you're asking about this one here, Timmy?
Yeah. Yes.
So with this one, okay, cool. Yeah, with this one, I basically, I went with just the color pigment and a little bit of water I added later. But with this one, I just kind of went for it and just did a blob of just the water and the pigment. And I added a little bit more water as I went because I didn't want it to be super like even, because I wanted different things to dry at different times. And so when I went over it with the hairdryer, because of the variation of wet and dry areas, it's going to dry areas faster and create those kind of really cool abstract and organic like wave looking things. I don't actually know what this is called, but I like it and I'm going to call it wave looking things. There's a lot of like technical terms used in watercolors, but really it's just fun. But since I have this lovely blue splotch back here, I'm going to use my rag or paper towel, if you have it around, to kind of work on pulling and lifting some of that color up to create not necessarily Juneau clouds, but like clouds that we might have on a sunny day here. Most of our clouds are more misty and foggy. So if you have a patch of color and you want to create like mist or fog and you already have the color down, or you want to create a cloud silhouette, you can take a rag or a paper towel. And my rag isn't super absorbent because I haven't used it in a while. take a paper towel here, and you can use that to just lift, and you can kind of bunch it up into different shapes to create like lighter amounts of texture or softer edges and things like that. Sometimes you'll get the texture left behind by the material you're using, depending on how dry this is. But that's a really easy way to create a little bit of cloud in a sky, or lighten up areas of a painting as well. And you can play around with it, because some areas are more dry now. So if I go back over with that and pull up more, it's going to add a little bit more depth to those clouds, cloud shape. The great thing about making clouds is they never look the same. So no one's going to know if it's really what you saw that day when you're painting or not. Yes, probably. So if your paint, when you're trying to do the like lifting to do the clouds, and you notice that like maybe your paint is a little drier than you want it to be, you can always slightly moisten your paper towel or rag as well, and you can do what's called like a scrubbing technique or a lifting, in which you kind of go in and kind of rehydrate that pigment and lift it that way. It does take a little extra work to do, but it creates a little bit of a different effect. And if you go too hard, too fast, you'll end up kind of lifting the texture of the paper. And so one of the nicer things about like 100% cotton watercolor paper is you can kind of rework it a little bit more than you can like a cellulose paper, because it's a thicker fiber. It's meant to hold onto the water more. You can do more layers and get the paper really, really wet without it starting to pill, I guess, or create like those weird textures. Like if you use watercolor paper on a printer paper, as you go and it gets a little too saturated, you'll notice those dark spots on the paper, and that has to do with the type of paper and the material of the paper. So